Hey guys, welcome to True Story About Infidelity. Today we're going to explore a true story where secrets, betrayals, and emotions are intertwined. Don't forget to prepare yourself mentally, because what we're about to tell may surprise, empathize, or even make you think deeply. Let's get started. The air in Asheville was crisp that evening, the kind of early spring chill that clung to the Blue Ridge Mountains like a stubborn fog. James Carter, Jim to everyone who knew him, adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror of his Ford F-150, parked just outside the grand gates of the Biltmore estate. The sprawling mansion-turned tourist attraction loomed in the distance, its turrets glowing softly under the amber lights. Tonight wasn't about sightseeing, though. It was their 6th anniversary, and Jim had pulled out all the stops. Reservations at the inn's upscale dining room, a bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon he'd saved for months to afford, and a small velvet box in his pocket containing a silver bracelet from a jeweler on Biltmore Avenue. It wasn't diamonds, his budget as a civil engineer didn't stretch that far, but it was something Lydia had admired in the shop window last fall. He stepped out of the truck, smoothing his navy blazer, and glanced at his watch. 7:45 p.m., March 14th, 2025. Lydia would be waiting inside. She'd insisted on meeting him there after her last art class at Asheville High. She'd been distant lately, her usual warmth replaced by a restlessness Jim couldn't quite place. He chalked it up to her workload. Teaching teenagers to paint Van Gogh knockoffs wasn't exactly a stress-free gig. Tonight, he hoped, would reset things. The dining room was everything he'd imagined. High ceilings with exposed beams, white tablecloths crisp as fresh snow, and the faint hum of classical music drifting from a pianist in the corner. Lydia sat near a window overlooking the estate's manicured gardens, her auburn hair catching the candlelight. She was beautiful, always had been, with sharp cheekbones and hazel eyes that could pin you in place. She wore an emerald green dress that hugged her frame, a rare departure from her usual jeans and sweater combo. Jim's chest tightened. 6 years, and she still took his breath away. "Hey, babe," he said, sliding into the chair across from her. "You look incredible." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thanks, Jim. You clean up nice, too." He grinned, handing her the velvet box. "Happy anniversary. I saw you eyeing this last October." Lydia opened it, her fingers lingering on the bracelet's delicate chain. "It's lovely," she said, her voice soft but oddly flat. She slipped it onto her wrist, then set the box aside without meeting his gaze. Jim frowned. Normally she'd be gushing, maybe even teasing him about how he'd finally learned to shop for her. Tonight she seemed a million miles away. The waiter arrived, pouring the Cabernet into crystal glasses. Jim raised his. "To us, 6 years and counting." Lydia clinked her glass against his, but her sip was hesitant. "To us," she echoed, staring into the wine like it held some secret. Dinner progressed, seared duck for him, a vegetarian risotto for her, but the conversation felt stilted. Usually they'd trade stories about their day, Jim's latest bridge project over the French Broad River, Lydia's students butchering still life sketches. Tonight she barely spoke, her eyes darting to the other tables, the windows, anywhere but him. By the time the plates were cleared, Jim's unease had morphed into a quiet dread. "Lyd," he said, setting his glass down carefully. "What's going on? You've been off all night." She took a deep breath, folding her napkin with precision. "Jim, there's something I need to talk about, something big." His heart stuttered. "Okay, I'm listening." She finally looked at him, her gaze steady but laced with something he couldn't name. Resolve, maybe, or guilt. "I've been thinking a lot lately, about us, about me. I love you, you know that, right?" "Of course," he said, leaning forward. "I love you too. What's this about?" "I need more," she paused, biting her lip. "I need to explore who I am outside of this, outside of us." Jim blinked, the words not quite registering. "Outside of us? What does that mean?" "I want an open marriage," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I want to see other people. I think it'll make me a better partner for you in the long run." The room tilted. Jim gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles whitening. "You want to see other people," he repeated, his voice low. "As in date other men?" "Yes," she admitted, her eyes dropping to her hands. "Maybe, if it feels right." He laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that drew a few glances from nearby tables. "You're telling me you want to sleep with other guys, and I'm supposed to just sit here and nod?" "Lydia, what the hell?" "Keep your voice down," she hissed, her cheeks flushing. "I didn't want to do this here, but you deserve to know." "Oh, I deserve to know," he shot back, sarcasm dripping from every word. "Thanks for the heads up. So what's the plan? You go off with some random dude while I wait at home like a good little husband?" "It's not like that," she said, reaching for his hand. He pulled back. "I love you, Jim. That hasn't changed. I just need this. For me, a few months, that's all. Then I'll be back, fully yours." "A few months," he echoed, incredulous. "You think I can just flip a switch and be okay with this? You're asking me to let you cheat?" "It's not cheating if you agree," she interrupted, her tone pleading. "Please, Jim, if you love me, you'll understand." He stared at her, the woman he'd vowed to spend his life with, and felt a crack split through his chest. "If you loved me, Lydia, you wouldn't ask this." Silence fell between them, heavy and suffocating. The pianist's notes faded into the background, the clink of silverware a distant hum. Jim stood, tossing his napkin onto the table. "I need air," he muttered, downing the last of his wine in one gulp. "Jim, wait!" she called, but he was already moving, weaving through the tables toward the exit. The cool night air hit him like a slap as he stepped onto the estate's stone patio, the distant lights of Asheville twinkling below. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stay there, couldn't look at her while she dismantled everything they'd built. He found his truck, climbed in, and drove. The winding roads of Highway 25 blurred past, the Blue Ridge Parkway a dark ribbon in his headlights. His head pounded, thoughts racing too fast to catch. Was this real? Was his wife, the woman who'd laughed with him over burnt pancakes in their tiny Asheville kitchen, really asking to break their vows? By the time he pulled over near the craggy pinnacle overlook, the sky was a deep indigo, stars piercing through the haze. He killed the engine, stepped out, and let the mountain wind whip against his face. Below, Asheville slept, oblivious to the unraveling of his world. He didn't know how long he stood there, but one thing crystallized in the chaos. Whatever happened next, his life would never be the same. Chapter 2. The Ultimatum. The craggy pinnacle overlook was silent except for the wind rustling through the rhododendrons that lined the trailhead. Jim leaned against the hood of his truck, the metal still warm from the drive, and stared out at the patchwork of lights dotting Asheville below. The Blue Ridge Mountains stretched endlessly into the darkness, their jagged silhouettes a stark contrast to the turmoil churning inside him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, 3 times now since he'd left the Biltmore estate, but he didn't check it. He knew it was Lydia, probably texting some half-hearted apology or begging him to come back and talk. He wasn't ready for that? Not yet. The Cabernet sat heavy in his stomach, a bitter aftertaste lingering on his tongue. 6 years of building a life together, buying their little craftsman bungalow on Montfort Avenue, planting a vegetable garden that never quite thrived, laughing over late-night reruns of The Office on their thrift store couch. And now she wanted to throw it all away for, what, a fling? A chance to explore herself? The phrase gnawed at him, vague and infuriating. What did that even mean? Wasn't she already herself, Lydia Carter, artist, teacher, his wife? He climbed back into the truck, the leather seat creaking under his weight, and rested his forehead against the steering wheel. The bracelet he'd given her flashed in his mind. $200 down the drain, a shiny trinket she'd barely acknowledged. He should have seen this coming. The late nights grading papers that stretched longer than usual, the way she'd started scrolling through her phone instead of talking to him, the sudden interest in girls' nights with Megan down in Charleston. Signs he'd ignored because he trusted her, because he loved her. The drive back to Montfort was a blur, the narrow streets of Asheville's historic district winding past Victorian homes and blooming dogwoods. It was nearly midnight when he pulled into the driveway, the bungalow's front porch light casting a warm glow over the peeling paint. Lydia's Prius was there, parked crookedly like she'd rushed home. He sat in the truck for a long moment, engine off, debating whether to go inside or just sleep in the cab. The thought of facing her made his chest tighten, but avoidance wouldn't solve this. He grabbed his keys and stepped out. The house smelled faintly of lavender. Her diffuser, always running in the living room. Lydia was on the couch, still in that green dress, her knees pulled up to her chest. Her eyes were red-rimmed, mascara smudged, but her expression was more defiant than remorseful. She looked up as he shut the door harder than necessary. "Where'd you go?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Out," he said curtly, tossing his keys onto the kitchen counter. Needed to think. Jim, we need to talk about this. Talk? He turned to face her, his voice rising despite his effort to stay calm. You dropped a bomb on me at dinner, Lydia. I am on an open marriage? You think that's something we just talk about like it's picking out new curtains? I didn't mean to blindside you, she said, standing up. I've been trying to figure out how to say it for weeks. I thought you'd understand. Understand? He laughed again, the sound raw and hollow. You want to sleep with other guys, and I'm supposed to nod and say, sure, honey, go have fun. What planet are you on? It's not about sleeping with anyone, she snapped, though her flush betrayed the lie. It's about me feeling alive again. I'm 30, Jim. I've been your wife since I was 24, and I love you, but I've never had a chance to figure out who I am outside of this. There's that phrase again, he said, crossing his arms. Explore yourself. What does that even mean? You're an artist, a teacher. You've got a whole life. What's missing? She hesitated, twisting the bracelet on her wrist. I don't feel desired. Not like I used to. We've settled into this routine. Work, bills, Netflix. I want passion. I want to feel wanted. Jim's jaw clenched. So I don't make you feel wanted? All the dinners I cook, the weekends I spend fixing up this place, the fact that I've never even looked at another woman, that's not enough. It's not about you not trying, she said quickly. It's me. I need to know what else is out there. Just for a little while, then I'll come back and we can be stronger for it. He stared at her, the woman he'd woken up next to every morning for 6 years, and felt like he was looking at a stranger. You don't get it, do you? You're asking me to sit here while you go play house with someone else. What am I supposed to do? Cheer you on? Date other people too? If you wanted to, sure, she said, though her voice wavered. But I'd hope you'd wait for me. Wait for you, he repeated, incredulous. You're unbelievable. You think I'm some mod you can put on a leash while you run off to Charleston with Megan and her crazy ideas? This isn't about Megan, she said, bristling. This is my decision. Right. Megan's just the divorced cheerleader egging you on. How's that worked out for her, by the way? Last I checked, she's living in a rented loft with a rotating door of losers. Stop it, Lydia said, her eyes flashing. She's my friend. She gets me. Yeah, well, I thought I did too, Jim shot back. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small living room. So what's the plan, huh? You move out, start swiping on Tinder, and I just, what, pretend everything's fine? I don't want to move out, she said, stepping closer. I'd stay here. We'd still be us. I just need some freedom. No. The word cut through the air, sharp and final. Jim stopped pacing, turning to face her. If you want to do this, you're not doing it under this roof. I'm not sharing a bed with you while you're screwing around. That's my line, Lydia. You cross it, you're out. Her mouth opened, then closed, shock flickering across her face. You're serious? Dead serious, he said, his voice low but steady. You want other men? Fine, pack a bag and go. Stay with Megan in Charleston, crash on her couch, whatever. But you don't get to have it both ways. You don't get to keep me as your safety net. Jim, I'm not leaving you, she said, her tone softening. I love you. This is temporary. Temporary infidelity is still infidelity, he interrupted. Call it what it is. You're breaking our vows. And I'm not going to stand here and watch it happen. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't back down. If you love me, you'll let me do this. You'll trust me to come back. He shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. If you loved me, you wouldn't ask. The silence that followed was deafening. Lydia wiped her eyes, her shoulders slumping. Jim felt a pang of guilt. Part of him wanted to pull her into his arms, tell her they'd figure it out. But the bigger part, the part that still had some pride left, wouldn't budge. I need time to think, she said finally, grabbing her purse from the couch. I'll stay at the school tonight. I've got keys to the art room. Fine, he said, his throat tight. Take all the time you need, but when you decide, you let me know. And if it's a yes to this open marriage crap, you're not coming back here until you've got a new place. She nodded, avoiding his gaze, and slipped out the front door. The Prius's headlights flared to life, and then she was gone, taillights fading down Montfort Avenue. Jim stood in the empty living room, the lavender scent mocking him now, and sank onto the couch. His hands trembled as he buried his face in them, the weight of the night crashing down. 6 years, gone in a single conversation. And all he could do was wait for her to choose, him or the freedom she thought she needed. Chapter 3, Charleston Nights. The drive from Asheville to Charleston took Lydia just over 4 hours, the Blue Ridge Mountains giving way to the flat, marshy low country as Highway 26 stretched south. She'd thrown a duffel bag into the back of her Prius the morning after Jim's ultimatum, her hands shaking as she packed jeans, a few blouses, and her sketchbook. The art room at Asheville High had been a cold, lonely refuge the night before. Sleeping on a cot surrounded by half-finished student canvases wasn't exactly a vision of freedom. By dawn, she'd called Megan, her voice cracking as she asked, "Can I crash with you for a bit?" Megan's reply was instant. "Get your ass down here. We'll figure it out." Now, as she crossed the Ravenel Bridge into Charleston, the sun dipped low over the Cooper River, painting the water gold and pink. The city's skyline rose ahead, church steeples piercing the horizon, pastel row houses lining the waterfront. Lydia cracked her window, letting the salty breeze flood the car. It smelled different here, wilder than the pine-scented air of Asheville. Maybe that was what she needed, a change sharp enough to jolt her out of the numbness she'd felt for months. Megan's loft was on King Street, a second-floor walk-up above a boutique selling overpriced linen dresses. The building was old, its exposed brick walls chipped and weathered, but the vibe was unmistakably Charleston. Chic yet laid back. Megan flung the door open before Lydia could knock, her blonde hair piled into a messy bun, a glass of rosé already in hand. "Welcome to freedom, babe," she said, pulling Lydia into a hug that smelled faintly of patchouli. "Thanks for this," Lydia said, dropping her bag by the door. The loft was small but vibrant, paintings leaning against every wall, a velvet sofa in mustard yellow, and a balcony overlooking the bustle of King Street below. It was chaotic, alive, everything her quiet life with Jim wasn't. "Mi casa es tu casa," Megan said, handing her a glass of wine. "You look like hell, though. What happened?" Lydia sank onto the sofa, kicking off her sneakers. "Jim flipped out. Told me if I want to see other people, I can't stay at home. Gave me an ultimatum, him or this." Megan snorted, flopping beside her. "Typical. Men love control until you take it back. Did you tell him it's not about him?" "I tried," Lydia said, sipping the rosé. It was crisp, too sweet, but it dulled the ache in her chest. "He thinks I'm cheating. Doesn't get that I just need something more." "Validation," Megan supplied, nodding sagely. "You're 30, hot as hell, and you've been playing house since you were a kid. You deserve to feel sexy again. He'll come around, or he won't. Either way, you're here now." Lydia managed a small smile. Megan had a way of making reckless decisions sound noble. 2 years ago, Megan's own marriage had imploded after her husband caught her with a bartender from Husk. She'd spun it into a manifesto of self-discovery, moving to Charleston and diving into the art scene. Lydia envied that confidence, even if it came with a trail of wreckage. The first few days blurred into a haze of settling in. Megan dragged her to Rainbow Row to sketch the pastel houses, then to Waterfront Park to sip coffee under the live oaks. By night, they hit the bars, Blind Tiger for craft beers, the rooftop at Vendu for skyline views. Lydia felt like a tourist in her own life, untethered and dizzy with possibility. She texted Jim once a simple, "I'm okay staying with Megan," but his reply was a curt, "good to know." No pleading, no anger, just silence. It stung more than she expected. On Friday night, Megan declared it time to get back out there. They ended up at Republic Lounge, a sleek spot on King Street where the crowd was young, out and dressed to impress. Lydia wore a black dress she'd borrowed from Megan, tighter than anything in her Asheville wardrobe, and felt a thrill as heads turned. Megan ordered them gin and tonics, then leaned in close. "See that guy by the bar? Blue shirt, dark hair. He's been eyeing you since we walked in." Lydia glanced over. The man was maybe 35, broad-shouldered, with an easy smile as he chatted with the bartender. "He's cute," she admitted, her stomach fluttering. "Go talk to him," Megan urged, nudging her. "You're free now. Act like it." Lydia hesitated, the weight of her wedding ring still on her finger, pressing against her skin. But then she thought of Jim's cold ultimatum, the way he'd shut her out. She deserved this, didn't she? She downed half her drink and crossed the room. "Hi," she said, sliding onto the stool beside him. "I'm Lydia." He turned, his grin widening. "Hey, Lydia, I'm Ethan. You from around here?" "Asheville originally," she said. "Just visiting." Nice. I'm a local. Grew up in Mount Pleasant. What brings you to Charleston? She paused, then went with the truth. A break. Needed some space. Ethan nodded, no judgment in his eyes. I get that. Charleston's good for resetting. They talked for an hour about his job as a real estate agent, her art classes, the best shrimp and grits in town. He swore by Fleet Landing. He was charming, attentive, his hand brushing hers once as he laughed at her story about a student painting a lopsided pineapple. When he asked for her number, she gave it without thinking, a rush of adrenaline drowning out the guilt. The next week was a whirlwind. Ethan texted her the next morning, inviting her to dinner at Fig, a trendy spot on Meeting Street. She said yes, and soon they were meeting for drinks at the Ordinary, strolling along the Battery at sunset. He was easy to be with, no expectations, no heavy talks about the future. One night, after too many oysters and a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc, he kissed her outside the restaurant, his hands warm on her waist. She kissed him back, the world tilting as she let herself fall into it. Megan cheered her on, of course. See, this is what you needed, she said one morning over coffee on the balcony. You're glowing, babe. Lydia wanted to believe her. Ethan made her feel seen, desired in a way Jim hadn't in years. But late at night, alone on Megan's pull-out couch, doubts crept in. She'd catch herself staring at her phone, waiting for Jim to call, to fight for her. He didn't. And the longer she stayed in Charleston, the more her old life felt like a dream she couldn't quite grasp. 2 weeks in, Ethan suggested a weekend trip. Savannah's only 2 hours away, he said over drinks at the gin joint. There's this great B&B on Jones Street. Fireplaces, the works. What do you say? Lydia's heart raced. A getaway with a man who wasn't her husband. It was the line she hadn't crossed yet. She thought of Jim, probably sitting in their silent bungalow, and a pang of something, guilt, longing, twisted in her gut. But then she pictured his stony face, his refusal to even hear her out. Yeah, she said, forcing a smile. Let's do it. The drive to Savannah was golden, Spanish moss dripping from the oaks along I-95. Ethan booked them into the Hamilton Turner Inn, a Victorian gem in the historic district. They spent the weekend wandering Forsyth Park, sipping cocktails at Artillery, entangled in the sheets of their four-poster bed. It was intoxicating, reckless, and raw, and Lydia let herself drown in it, pushing Jim further into the shadows of her mind. But on Sunday morning, as they ate beignets at Huey's on River Street, Ethan's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his smile faltering. Work, he muttered, stepping outside to take the call. Through the window, Lydia watched him pace, his tone sharp. When he came back, he was distracted, checking his watch. I might need to cut this short, he said, a client emergency. Okay, she said, masking her disappointment. No big deal. He drove her back to Charleston that afternoon, dropping her at Megan's with a quick kiss and a vague promise to call. She didn't hear from him for 3 days. When she finally texted, his reply was polite but distant. Been swamped. Talk soon? It hit her then. He wasn't looking for anything real. She'd been a diversion, a weekend fling. The realization stung, but she shoved it down, telling herself this was part of the journey. Megan noticed her mood. Don't sweat it, she said that night, pouring them bourbon. Plenty of fish out there. You're just getting started. Lydia nodded, staring out at the neon glow of King Street. She'd wanted freedom, and she had it. Messy, thrilling, and lonelier than she'd expected. But as the bourbon burned her throat, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd traded something solid for a handful of fleeting sparks. Chapter 4. The Mountain Escape. The Montfort bungalow felt like a tomb in the weeks after Lydia left. Jim rattled around its empty rooms, the silence broken only by the hum of the fridge or the occasional creak of the hardwood floors. He'd wake up reaching for her side of the bed, only to find it cold and untouched, the lavender diffuser she loved now unplugged and gathering dust on the dresser. Her text, I'm okay, staying with Megan, sat unanswered in his phone, a taunting reminder of her choice. He typed a dozen replies, angry ones, pleading ones, but deleted them all. What was there to say? She'd made her bed, and it wasn't here anymore. Work kept him sane, barely. His job at the engineering firm on Patton Avenue demanded long hours drafting plans for a new pedestrian bridge over the Swannanoa River. He threw himself into it, staying late to tweak calculations, anything to avoid coming home to that hollow house. But even that wasn't enough. By mid-April, the walls were closing in, and Jim knew he had to get out of Asheville, out of the memories. He'd heard about a hiking group in Knoxville from a coworker, a casual mention over coffee in the break room. They meet up at Ejam's Nature Center every Saturday, the guy had said. Good people, great trails. Might do you some good. Jim wasn't much of a hiker. Lydia had always been the outdoorsy one, dragging him on picnics to Pisgah National Forest. But the idea stuck. Knoxville was only 2 hours away, close enough for a day trip, far enough to feel like an escape. He packed a backpack with water, a sandwich, and his old hiking boots, and on a crisp Saturday morning, he pointed his F-150 west on I-40. The drive through the Smoky Mountains was a balm, the rolling green ridges and mist-cloaked valleys washing away some of the tension in his shoulders. Knoxville greeted him with a sprawl of brick buildings and the lazy curve of the Tennessee River. IJAM's Nature Center sat just south of downtown, a 300-acre oasis of trails and quarries hugged by the river's edge. Jim parked near the Visitor Center, a low-slung building with a green roof, and joined a cluster of about 15 people milling around a trail map. They ranged from 20-somethings in Patagonia gear to retirees with walking sticks, all chattering about the day's route. "You knew?" a voice asked as he adjusted his pack. He turned to see a woman, late 20s he guessed, with dark blonde hair pulled into a ponytail and a freckled nose. She wore a faded Knoxville Smokies t-shirt and carried a beat-up Nikon camera slung around her neck. "Yeah," Jim said, managing a half smile. "First time, I'm Jim." "Claire," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, her hazel eyes bright with curiosity. "Welcome to the chaos. We're doing the Meads Quarry Loop today. About 5 miles. You up for it?" "Guess we'll find out," he said, and she laughed, a sound that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. The hike was tougher than he'd expected, the trail winding up rocky switchbacks and past limestone cliffs scarred from old quarrying days. Claire fell into step beside him, pointing out landmarks, the quarry lake shimmering below, a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. She was a freelance journalist, she told him, mostly covering outdoor life for regional magazines. "Keeps me out of an office," she said, snapping a photo of a wildflower patch. "What about you?" "Engineer," he said. "Bridges, roads, that kind of thing. From Asheville." "Nice town," she said. "What brings you up here?" He hesitated, the truth too raw to spill to a stranger. "Just needed a change of scenery." She nodded, not pressing, and they kept walking. The group stopped at the quarry overlook for lunch, spreading out on boulders to eat. Jim unwrapped his sandwich, peanut butter, nothing fancy, and Claire offered him a handful of trail mix. "You're quiet," she said, popping an almond into her mouth. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," he lied, then softened. "Rough couple of weeks, that's all." "Been there," she said, her tone light but knowing. "The mountains fix a lot, though. Stick with us. You'll see." By the time they looped back to the parking lot, Jim's legs ached, but his head felt clearer than it had in weeks. The group lingered, making plans to grab beers at pretentious beer company downtown. "You in?" Claire asked, slinging her camera into her bag. "Sure," he said, surprising himself. "Why not?" The brewery was a quirky spot on Central Street, all exposed brick and mismatched furniture, with a chalkboard listing IPAs and stouts brewed in-house. Jim ordered a porter, its dark bitterness matching his mood, while Claire went for a citrusy pale ale. They sat at a long communal table with the others, conversation flowing easy, trail stories, bad weather mishaps, a guy named Tom's tale of getting lost in the Cherokee National Forest. Jim didn't say much, but he listened, letting the chatter drown out the noise in his head. Claire nudged him as the night wound down. "You're not half bad at this socializing thing," she teased. "Coming back next week?" "Maybe," he said, and she grinned. He drove home that night, the Knoxville skyline fading in his rear view, and felt a flicker of something. Hope, maybe, or just relief. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get him through the week. He went back the next Saturday, then the one after that. The hikes got longer. House Mountain, then a grueling trek up Mount LeConte via the Alum Cave Trail. Claire was a constant, always there with a quip or a photo op, and Jim found himself looking forward to her company. She didn't pry, didn't flirt, just let him be. It was a kindness he hadn't realized he needed. By early May, the group planned an overnight camping trip to Big South Fork, a rugged park straddling the Tennessee-Kentucky line. Jim volunteered to haul firewood in his truck, earning a round of cheers. They set up camp near Angel Falls Overlook, the Cumberland Plateau stretching out in a sea of green. That night, under a sky thick with stars, Claire plopped down beside him on a log by the fire. "Okay, Jim," From Asheville, she said, poking the flames with a stick. You've been coming out here for a month. Either you really love hiking or you're running from something. Which is it? He stared into the fire, the crackle of burning pine filling the pause. Both, I guess, he said finally. Wife left a few weeks back. Wanted an open marriage. I didn't. Claire whistled low. Damn, that's a gut punch. Yeah, he said, his voice rough. Told her if she wanted that, she couldn't stay. She's in Charleston now doing whatever. And you're here, she said, no pity in her tone, just fact. Smart move, beats wallowing. Didn't feel smart at the time, he admitted. Still doesn't sometimes. She nodded, tossing her stick into the flames. I got dumped 2 years ago. Fiancé. Found out he was sleeping with his coworker. Took me 6 months to stop checking his Instagram. Then I started hiking. Saved my sanity. Sorry, Jim said, meaning it. That sucks. It did. Now it doesn't. She shrugged, a small smile tugging at her lips. Point is, you're not alone in the mess, and you're tougher than you think. He looked at her then, really looked. Her sharp jawline softened by the firelight, the way her eyes held his without flinching. Thanks, he said, and it came out quieter than he meant. Any time, she replied, bumping his shoulder with hers. Now help me scare Tom with that bear story you told last week. He's gullible as hell. Jim laughed, a real one this time, and followed her to the other side of the fire. The night stretched on, the group trading tales until the embers died, and for the first time in weeks, Jim slept without dreaming of Lydia. The mountains didn't fix everything, not yet, but they were a start, and Claire, with her easy grin and steady presence, was part of it. Chapter 5. Savannah sunsets. The road to Savannah unfurled like a ribbon through the low country, I-95, cutting a straight path past sprawling marshes and ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss. Lydia sat in the passenger seat of Ethan's Jeep, the windows down, the warm May air whipping her hair into tangles. He'd picked her up from Megan's loft that Friday morning, his easy smile and a playlist of Tom Petty tunes setting the tone for the weekend. 2 hours to paradise, he'd said, tossing her duffel into the back. She'd grin, the promise of escape drowning out the faint unease prickling at her edges. Savannah greeted them with its sultry charm, the historic district, a maze of cobblestone streets and shaded squares. The Hamilton Turner Inn, where Ethan had booked their stay, stood on Lafayette Square, a grand Victorian with wraparound porches and stained glass windows that glowed in the late afternoon light. Lydia stepped out of the Jeep, her sandals clicking against the brick sidewalk, and felt a rush of exhilaration. This was what she'd wanted, a break from the ordinary, a taste of something reckless and alive. Fancy, huh? Ethan said, hauling their bags from the trunk. Wait till you see the room, fireplace and all. Impressive, she said, following him up the steps. The inn's lobby smelled of polished wood and jasmine, a far cry from the lavender-scented stillness of the Montfort bungalow. She pushed the thought of Jim aside. He hadn't texted since her last message, and she told herself that was fine. This weekend wasn't about him. Their room was on the second floor, a cozy nook with a 4-poster bed and a brick fireplace already crackling with a small blaze. Ethan dropped the bags and pulled her into a kiss, his hand sliding down her back. Worth the drive, he murmured against her lips. Definitely, she said, kissing him back. The heat of it, the thrill of being wanted, chased away the lingering doubts. She'd spent weeks in Charleston chasing this feeling, and here it was, hers for the taking. Friday night blurred into a haze of cocktails and wandering. They started at Artillery, a speakeasy on Bull Street where the bartender mixed her a lavender martini that tasted like summer. Ethan's arms stayed slung around her shoulders as they strolled through Forsyth Park, the fountain glowing under strings of lights. He was charming as ever, spinning stories about growing up in Mount Pleasant, crabbing off the docks, sneaking beers on Shem Creek. Lydia laughed, leaned into him, let the night carry her. Dinner was at the Gray, a restored Greyhound station-turned-restaurant on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. They split a plate of oysters and a bottle of Pinot Grigio, the conversation flowing as easily as the wine. You're different here, Ethan said, twirling his glass. Looser. I like it. Charleston's been good for me, she said, though the words felt rehearsed. Asheville was stifling. Small towns can do that, he agreed. You ever miss it? She hesitated, the image of Jim's quiet steadiness flashing unbidden. Sometimes, she admitted, then waved it off. But this is better. He grinned, clinking his glass against hers. To better. Later, back at the inn, they stumbled into bed, the wine and the heat of the day blurring the edges of everything. Ethan's hands were sure, his touch igniting her in ways she hadn't felt in years. She gave herself over to it, losing herself in the rhythm of it all, the creak of the old bed frame a distant soundtrack. Afterward, he fell asleep quickly, his breathing steady beside her. Lydia lay awake, staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling from the dying fire. The high was fading, and in its place came a hollow ache she couldn't name. Saturday dawned bright and humid, the kind of southern heat that clung to your skin. They spent the morning exploring River Street's candy shops, where she bought a bag of pralines, and the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, its spires piercing the sky. Ethan snapped photos of her on his phone, laughing when she posed dramatically in front of a moss-draped oak. "You're a natural," he said, and she basked in the attention, even as a small voice whispered that it wasn't enough. That night, they hit Husk Savannah, a cozy spot on Oglethorpe Avenue. The bourbon flowed, too much maybe, and by the time they spilled back onto the street, Lydia was dizzy with it. Ethan pulled her into an alley off Broughton Street, kissing her hard against the brick wall, his hands roaming. She matched his urgency, chasing that spark again. But when they broke apart, his eyes were glassy, distant. "You're fun, you know that?" he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "So are you," she replied, forcing a smile. Fun. Was that all this was? Sunday morning brought a shift. They grabbed beignets and coffee at Huey's on River Street, sitting at a table overlooking the Savannah River. The water glittered under the sun, freighters gliding lazily past. Lydia bit into a beignet, powdered sugar dusting her fingers, and watched Ethan scroll through his phone. He'd been quieter since breakfast, checking his watch every few minutes. "Everything okay?" she asked, wiping her hands on a napkin. "Yeah," he said, too quick. His phone buzzed and he glanced at it, his jaw tightening. "Work stuff. Might need to head back early." "On a Sunday?" she said, raising an eyebrow. "Client emergency," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. "Big sale falling through. Happens sometimes." She nodded, though something in his tone didn't sit right. He stepped outside to take a call, and through the window, she saw him pacing, his voice low but sharp. When he returned, his smile was forced. "We should probably hit the road soon," he said. "Sorry to cut it short." "No worries," she said, masking the sting. "It's been great." The drive back to Charleston was subdued, Tom Petty replaced by a sports radio station Ethan flipped to halfway through. He dropped her off at Megan's loft with a quick kiss and a vague, "I'll call you," then peeled away down King Street. Lydia stood on the sidewalk, the praline bag dangling from her hand, and felt the weekend's magic evaporate like mist off the marshes. Megan was sprawled on the sofa when she walked in, a sketch pad balanced on her knees. "How was it?" she asked, not looking up. "Amazing," Lydia said, dropping her duffel by the door. "Savannah's gorgeous." Ethan was sweet. Megan smirked. "Sweet, huh? That's code for he's already ghosting you." "He's not," Lydia said, though her voice lacked conviction. "He's just busy." "Sure," Megan said, flipping a page. "They always are." Ethan didn't text that night, or the next. By Tuesday, Lydia caved and sent a casual, "Hey, you alive?" His reply came hours later. "Crazy week, sorry. Talk soon?" It was polite, detached, the kind of message you sent to keep someone on the hook without committing. She stared at it, the hollow ache from Savannah blooming into something sharper. He'd been a fling, nothing more, a charming distraction who'd gotten what he wanted and moved on. Megan noticed her moping over coffee the next morning. "Told you," she said, stirring sugar into her mug. "Guys like that don't stick around. But who cares? You had fun, right?" "Yeah," Lydia said, though the word tasted bitter. "Fun." She threw herself back into Charleston's nightlife that week, letting Megan drag her to the Commodore for live music, the Belmont for late-night cocktails. She flirted with a guy at the bar, a tattooed chef from Pugin's Porch, but didn't give him her number. The thrill was fading, each night blurring into the last. She'd wanted freedom, validation, but what she'd found was fleeting, empty calories and a diet of self-discovery. Late one night, alone on the pull-out couch, she scrolled through her phone. Jim's name lingered in her contacts, untouched for weeks. She opened their last thread, his good-to-know staring back at her. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard, a dozen unsent messages flashing through her mind. "I miss you. This was a mistake. Can we talk?" But she locked the screen instead. He'd made his stance clear, and she'd made her choice. Still, as the neon glow of King Street filtered through the blinds, Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that her grand escape was unraveling. Savannah had been a high, but the crash was coming, and she wasn't sure she'd like what she found at the bottom. Chapter 6, The Breaking Point. Jim's days had settled into a new rhythm by late May, the sharp edges of Lydia's departure dulled by routine. Mornings meant coffee on the Montfort bungalow's porch, watching the neighborhood wake up. Dog walkers, joggers, the old guy across the street watering his roses. Work consumed his weekdays, the Swannanoa River Bridge project nearing its final design phase. And weekends belonged to Knoxville, long hikes with the E-Jams group, cold beers with Claire and the others at Crafty Bastard or Schultzbräu. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was stability, a lifeline he clung to. He'd stopped checking Lydia's social media after the first week, knowing it'd only twist the knife. She texted once more after her initial message, a vague, "Hope you're doing okay," 2 weeks back, but he hadn't replied. What was there to say? She'd chosen Charleston, chosen exploring herself over their marriage. He wasn't going to beg her back. Still, the silence gnawed at him, a quiet ache he couldn't quite shake. That changed on a humid Thursday evening. Jim was sprawled on the couch, a baseball game droning on the TV. Braves versus the Nationals. A rare night off from the gym when his phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah, Lydia's coworker at Asheville High, a bubbly art teacher who'd always liked him. "Hey Jim, not sure if you want to know this, but Lydia posted pics from Savannah last weekend. With some guy. Thought you should hear it from a friend." Attached was a screenshot, Lydia on Instagram, beaming in front of Forsyth Park's fountain, a man's arm around her waist. The caption read, "Savannah Nights, everything else." Jim stared at it, the room tilting. He zoomed in on the photo. The guy was tall, dark-haired, his face half hidden, but smug enough to guess the type. Lydia's smile was wide, unguarded, the kind she used to flash at him over breakfast. Savannah, a weekend getaway, with someone else. The reality hit like a sucker punch. She wasn't just exploring, she was gone. He tossed the phone onto the coffee table, his hands trembling. The Braves scored a run, the crowd roaring on screen, but it was white noise. He stood pacing the living room, the hardwood creaking under his bare feet. 6 years, vows, a home, a life, and she'd traded it for a fling with some Charleston sleaze. Anger surged, hot and jagged, but beneath it was something worse, betrayal, raw and deep. He'd held out hope, some stupid part of him thinking she'd come to her senses. That hope died with that photo. The next morning he called in sick, first time in years, and drove downtown to Biltmore Avenue. His lawyer, Tom Grayson, had an office above a coffee shop, a cramped space cluttered with legal books and framed diplomas. Tom was an old college buddy, more into real estate than divorce, but he'd promised to handle this if it came to it. Jim sat across from him, the Instagram screenshot printed and slapped on the desk. "She's done," Jim said, his voice flat. "I want out." Tom leaned back, adjusting his glasses. "You sure? North Carolina's a no-fault state. You don't need proof of anything to file. But if she's screwing around, we can use it for leverage. Alimony, assets, whatever." "I don't care about leverage," Jim said. "I just want it over. 50-50, split, clean break. She can have half the house equity, whatever's in savings. I'm not fighting her for scraps." Tom nodded, scribbling notes. "Fair enough. I'll draft the papers. You got an address for her?" "Charleston. She's with Megan Harper. King Street, I think. I'll get the exact number." "Got it. We'll serve her next week. You holding up okay?" Jim shrugged. "Been better." Tom clapped him on the shoulder as he left. "Hang in there, man. You're doing the right thing." Back home, Jim started packing up Lydia's things. Clothes still in the closet, art supplies scattered in the spare room. He shoved them into boxes, each item a stab of memory. The scarf she'd worn on their Smoky Mountain honeymoon. The sketchbook from their first anniversary. He hauled the boxes to the garage, locked the door, and changed the deadbolt on the front entrance. She wasn't coming back. Not as his wife, anyway. That weekend, he drove to Knoxville, needing the mountains more than ever. The group hiked Sharp's Ridge, a steep trail with a killer view of the city skyline. Claire noticed his mood right away, falling into step beside him as they climbed. "You're quieter than usual," she said, brushing sweat from her brow. "What's up?" "Lydia's gone full tourist," he said, keeping his eyes on the path. "Savannah last weekend, with some guy." Claire winced. "Ouch, you okay?" Not really, he admitted. Filed for divorce yesterday. She stopped, turning to face him. Wow, that's big. Yeah. He kicked a rock off the trail, watching it tumble down the slope. Had to be done. For what it's worth, she said, she's an idiot. Anyone who ditched you for a fling doesn't deserve you. He met her gaze, her hazel eyes steady and warm. Thanks, Claire. They finished the hike in companionable silence, the group sprawling out at the ridge's summit for lunch. Jim didn't say much, but Claire's presence, solid, unjudging, kept him grounded. That night, over beers at Suttree's high-gravity tavern, he felt the first real flicker of relief. The marriage was ending, but he wasn't alone. Meanwhile, in Charleston, Lydia's world was fraying. Ethan's texts had dried up completely after Savannah. No calls, no vague promises, just silence. She'd brushed it off at first, diving back into King Street's bar scene with Megan, but the rejection lingered, a bruise she couldn't ignore. She'd met another guy, Travis, a chef at 167 Raw, over oysters and whiskey one night. He was flirty, rough around the edges, and took her back to his place on East Bay Street after closing. It was quick, messy, nothing like the slow burn of Savannah, and when he didn't text the next day, she wasn't surprised. Megan kept pushing. You're living, babe, she'd say, pouring bourbon on the balcony. This is what freedom looks like. But freedom was starting to taste sour. Lydia's bank account was dwindling. Rent to Megan, drinks, new clothes to keep up the facade. Her job at Asheville High was on hold. She'd taken a leave of absence, claiming personal reasons, but she couldn't stay away forever. And the high of being desired was fading, replaced by a nagging emptiness. The divorce papers arrived on a rainy Tuesday, delivered by a bored-looking courier to Megan's loft. Lydia tore open the envelope, her hands shaking as she read the words, Petition for Dissolution of Marriage. Jim's signature stared back at her, bold and final. There was a note about asset division, half the house, half their savings, and a restraining order barring her from the Montfort address until the process was complete. She sank onto the couch, the rain drumming against the windows, and felt the floor drop out from under her. He's serious, she whispered, clutching the papers. Megan peeked over her shoulder. Shit, he's not messing around. I thought he'd wait, Lydia said, her voice cracking. I thought I'd go back eventually. Megan snorted. Guys don't wait forever, Lyd. You've been gone 2 months banging half of Charleston. What did you expect? I wasn't banging half of Charleston, she snapped, tears welling. I just needed something. Well, you got it, Megan said, shrugging. Now you've got this too. Lydia spent the night staring at the ceiling, the papers crumpled beside her. She'd wanted freedom, but this wasn't it. This was loss, cold and absolute. She dialed Jim's number, her thumb hovering over the call button, but stopped. What would she say? I'm sorry? Take me back. He'd made his choice, just like she had. The next morning, she texted instead. Got the papers. Can we talk? His reply came hours later, short and clipped. Nothing to say, it's done. She didn't respond. What could she? Charleston's neon night stretched ahead, but the spark was gone. Travis texted her that afternoon, round 2 tonight, and she deleted it. Megan dragged her to the alley for bowling and beers, but Lydia barely touched her drink, the laughter around her hollow. She'd chased validation, and all she'd found was a pile of ashes, and a husband who wasn't hers anymore. Chapter 7, A New Dawn. Summer settled over Asheville like a warm blanket, the Blue Ridge Mountains glowing green under a June sky. Jim stood in the driveway of the Montfort bungalow, watching a moving crew haul boxes into a rented U-Haul. The divorce papers had been finalized 2 weeks ago. No courtroom drama, just a quiet settlement signed at Tom's office. 50-50 split as he'd wanted. Lydia got her half of the house equity, about $140,000, and he'd kept the F-150 and his 401k. The bungalow was on the market, a for sale sign staked in the front yard. Its craftsman charm already drawing offers. He didn't care who bought it. It wasn't home anymore. Knoxville had become his refuge. The weekend hikes with the Ajams group, the late-night beers with Claire and the crew, they'd stitched him back together, piece by piece. He'd rented a small apartment near the University of Tennessee campus, a one-bedroom walk-up on Clinch Avenue with a view of the river. It wasn't much, bare walls, a second-hand couch, but it was a fresh start. He'd moved in the week after the divorce, the U-Haul's tailgate slamming shut on Montfort for good. Claire had been there from the start, a steady presence he hadn't expected to lean on so hard. She'd helped him unpack, lugging boxes up the narrow stairs with a grin. "You owe me pizza for this," she'd said, collapsing onto the couch after the last load. He'd ordered from Big Ed's on Kingston Pike, pepperoni for her, sausage for him, and they'd eaten on the floor, laughing over his terrible attempt to assemble an IKEA bookshelf. It was easy with her, uncomplicated in a way his life hadn't been for months. That Saturday, the group hiked Mount Cameron, a grueling 11-mile round trip in the Smokies. Jim's legs burned as they climbed the ridge, the trail's rocky switchbacks testing his stamina. Claire kept pace, her camera snapping shots of the panoramic views, rolling peaks stretching into North Carolina. At the summit, they sprawled on the fire tower's platform, the wind whipping through the trees below. "You're getting good at this," Claire said, passing him a water bottle. "Might make a mountain man out of you yet." "High praise," he said, taking a swig. "Thanks for dragging me into it." "Anytime," she said, her hazel eyes catching the sunlight. "You're stuck with us now." He smiled, a real one, and felt something shift. Later, as the group trudged back to the trailhead, Claire lingered beside him. "Hey," she said, her tone softer. "You doing okay? With the divorce and all?" "Yeah," he said, surprised to mean it. "Better than I thought. You?" She laughed. "I'm not the one getting divorced, but I'm good, better with you around." The words hung there, simple but loaded. Jim met her gaze, his pulse kicking up. "Same," Maggie said, and she bumped his shoulder, a quiet understanding passing between them. That night, they skipped the group's usual brewery stop and ended up at his place. He grilled burgers on a cheap charcoal grill he'd set up on the tiny balcony, the Tennessee River glinting orange in the sunset. Claire sipped a beer, Knoxville brewed Black Horse IPA, and watched him flip the patties. "Not bad, Carter," she said. "You're domesticating." "Had to learn sometime," he said, sliding a burger onto her plate. Lydia wasn't big on cooking. She took a bite, nodding approval. "Her loss. So what's next for you?" He shrugged, sitting across from her. "Work's good. Got a promotion last week. Lead engineer on a new project in Chattanooga. And this," he gestured to the apartment, the river, her, "feels right." "Good," she said, her smile softening. "You deserve it." After dinner, they moved inside, the night growing cool. Claire kicked off her shoes, curling up on the couch as he flipped on a movie. The Big Lebowski, her pick. Halfway through, she shifted closer, her head resting on his shoulder. Jim froze, then relaxed, his arms settling around her. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a quiet moment, but it felt like a turning point. "Claire," he said, his voice low, "this okay?" She tilted her head up, her eyes searching his. "Yeah, you?" "Yeah," he said, and she kissed him, slow, tentative, then sure. He kissed her back, the weight of the past months falling away. It wasn't Lydia, wasn't the life he'd lost. It was new, and it was his. By July, they were a couple, unofficial but real. The group teased them mercilessly on hikes, Tom staging dramatic fake proposals at trailheads. Jim didn't mind. Claire fit into his life like she'd always been there, her laugh a constant in his days. He told her about Lydia one night, the whole messy story, and she listened. No judgment, just her hand in his. "You're better off," she said when he finished. "And I'm not just saying that because I'm biased." He laughed. "Noted." Meanwhile, in Charleston, Lydia's world was crumbling. The divorce had hit her hard, a finality she hadn't braced for. She'd stayed with Megan, the loft's chaos a poor substitute for the stability she'd left behind. Her fling with Travis had fizzled. He'd ghosted after a few nights, and the others blurred into a parade of faces she barely remembered. King Street's bars lost their shine, the neon glow mocking her as she stumbled home alone too often. Money was tight. Her leave from Asheville High was unpaid, and her savings, boosted by the divorce settlement, were draining fast. Megan charged her rent now, $500 a month, and the pricey cocktails didn't help. She'd started subbing at a Charleston middle school, teaching art to kids who didn't care, but it barely covered her bills. The freedom she'd craved felt like a trap. Then came the fallout. A coworker from Asheville, Sarah of all people, had spread word of her Savannah trip, and whispers reached her old school. Parents complained, rumors swirling about her wild lifestyle. The principal called, voice clipped. "We'd prefer you keep your personal life discreet if you return." Return? She wasn't sure she could. Charleston was her exile, self-imposed and suffocating. One night, after too many whiskeys at the Darling Oyster Bar, Lydia hooked up with a guy from the bar. Mike, a shrimper with rough hands and a lazy grin. It was sloppy, desperate, and the next morning she woke up queasy in his Folly Beach rental. A week later, the nausea didn't fade. A drugstore test confirmed it. Pregnant. She sat on Megan's bathroom floor, the stick trembling in her hand, and laughed. A brittle, broken sound. Mike didn't answer her call. Neither did Travis. She didn't know who the father was, and it didn't matter. They were gone. Megan found her there, still clutching the test. "Shit, Lyd," she said, crouching down. "What now?" "I don't know," Lydia whispered. "I messed up." "You'll figure it out," Megan said. But her tone lacked its usual bravado. Even she saw the wreckage. Lydia kept the pregnancy quiet, teaching through the nausea, avoiding the bars. Her mother called, furious after hearing from Sarah. "You threw away a good man for this?" she'd shouted. Lydia had no defense. She'd wanted excitement, validation, and now she had a baby on the way and a life in pieces. By August, Jim and Claire were planning a trip, Chattanooga for his work, then a detour to Fall Creek Falls for camping. They stood on his balcony one evening, the river dark below, and he pulled her close. "You ever think about the future?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said, leaning into him. "You?" "Yeah," he said, "thinking it looks pretty good with you in it." She smiled, kissing him soft. "Same." A year later, in the summer of 2006, they married. A small ceremony at Ijam's, the quarry lake sparkling behind them. Claire's dress was simple, her Nikon slung over her shoulder even then. Tom was best man, the group cheering as they kissed. By Christmas, their daughter arrived, Ella, with Claire's hazel eyes and Jim's stubborn chin. They bought a house in Knoxville's Old North neighborhood, a fixer-upper with a porch for mornings like Montford's. Lydia, meanwhile, stayed in Charleston raising her son, Liam, alone in a cramped apartment off Calhoun Street. She went back to teaching full-time, her wild days of memories she didn't share. The school kept her on, but the whispers never fully died. She saw Jim's wedding announcement on a friend's Facebook, a pang hitting her chest, but she didn't reach out. That door was closed. Jim stood on his new porch one crisp fall morning, Ella in his arms, Claire beside him. The past was a shadow, faint and fading. He'd lost a marriage, but he'd found a life, one he wouldn't trade. Charleston, Savannah, Asheville, they were chapters closed. Knoxville was home now, and the dawn was his. Chapter 8, Epilogue. Knoxville, Tennessee, October 2029. The leaves in Knoxville's Old North neighborhood blazed orange and red, a fiery canopy over the quiet streets. Jim Carter stood on the porch of his two-story fixer-upper, a mug of coffee warming his hands as the morning fog drifted off the Tennessee River. The house was a labor of love, peeling paint patched. A new roof installed last spring, the porch swing creaking softly where Claire rocked Ella to sleep most evenings. 4 years since the divorce, in this place, this life, felt like his in a way Asheville never had again. Ella, now 3, toddled out the front door, her dark curls bouncing as she dragged a stuffed bear behind her. "Daddy, look," she said, holding up the bear, its button eye dangling by a thread. "Another casualty, huh?" Jim said, crouching to inspect it. "We'll fix him up. Where's Mama?" "Kitchen," Ella said, then darted back inside, leaving the screen door banging. Jim smiled, following her in. The house smelled of cinnamon, Claire's Saturday ritual of baking apple muffins filling the air. She stood at the counter, her Nikon resting beside a bowl of batter, flour dusting her Knoxville Smokies t-shirt. "Morning, hero," she said, glancing up with a grin. "Ella's already planning a bear hospital." "Sounds serious," Jim said, sliding an arm around her waist. "Need a sous chef?" "Always," she said, kissing him quick before handing him a spoon. "Stir that while I preheat the oven." They worked in tandem, Ella chattering about her bear's surgery from a stool nearby. It was mundane, perfect, moments Jim had stopped taking for granted. His promotion to senior engineer kept him busy, commuting to Chattanooga twice a week for a highway project. But weekends were sacred. Hikes with the iJams crew had scaled back since Ella's birth, but Claire still dragged them to Big Ridge State Park or the Smokies when the weather held. Later that morning, they drove to World's Fair Park, Knoxville's downtown green space, for Ella to run off energy. The sun sphere gleamed gold in the autumn light, a relic of the '82 Expo casting shadows over the splash pad. Jim watched Claire chase Ella through the fountains, her laughter echoing, and felt a quiet gratitude settle in his chest. He'd lost Lydia, lost the life he'd planned, but what he'd gained, Claire, Ella, this was worth it. Last month over beers at Suttrie's, he'd asked Claire about another kid. She'd grin, said, "Let's talk after the muffins are perfected," and he knew they'd get there. News of Lydia trickled in sometimes, mostly through Sarah's occasional updates. She was still in Charleston, raising a boy, Liam, alone. Jim didn't ask much, didn't want to. The divorce had severed their story, and he'd made peace with that. Claire had been his anchor, Knoxville his rebirth. The past was a ghost he didn't chase. Charleston, South Carolina, October 2029. Across the state line, Charleston hummed with its usual rhythm, the battery's palmettos swaying in a salty breeze. Lydia Carter, no, just Lydia now, sat on a bench in White Point Garden, watching Liam, 4, dig in the sand with a plastic shovel. His hair was sandy blonde, his eyes a hazel she couldn't pin to any one man, and she didn't try. He was hers, a tether to a life she'd stumbled into. The last 4 years had been a slow unraveling, then a reluctant rebuilding. After the divorce, she'd stayed with Megan until the pregnancy forced a shift. The loft's chaos wasn't fit for a baby, and Megan's patience had worn thin. Her own string of flings and art shows, leaving little room for a crying infant. Lydia had found a one-bedroom off Calhoun Street, a cramped walk-up with peeling wallpaper and a view of a parking lot. Her half of the Montford equity paid the deposit, but the rest, rent, diapers, daycare, came from her job at a Charleston charter school. Teaching kept her afloat, though the whispers never fully faded. Parents still side-eyed her at conferences, murmurs of her wild phase lingering like humidity. She'd stopped drinking, stopped chasing the bars on King Street, her nights now spent with Liam, reading Goodnight Moon, patching scraped knees. He was a good kid, curious and stubborn, and she loved him fiercely, even if his arrival had shattered her illusions. Ethan, Travis, Mike, none of them stuck around. She'd tracked Mike down after Liam's birth, a tense call to his Folly Beach number, but he'd denied everything, hung up when she pressed. DNA didn't matter. She'd stopped looking for answers. Her mother had softened over time, visiting once a year from Raleigh, bringing toys and guilt trips in equal measure. "You could have had it all with Jim," she'd say, and Lydia would nod, too tired to argue. She'd seen Jim's wedding announcement last year on Sarah's Facebook, a candid shot of him and Claire at iJams, Ella in a tiny flower crown. It stung, a sharp twist of regret, but she didn't linger. He'd moved on, built something solid. She hadn't. Charleston was her cage now, the freedom she'd chased, a mirage that left her with a son and a shadow of who she'd been. Today, Liam ran to her, sand caked on his hands. "Mommy, look, castle," he said, pointing to a lumpy mound. "Amazing, buddies," she said, brushing his hair back. "Want a juice box?" He nodded, climbing onto the bench, and she dug one from her bag. The park was quiet, the harbor glinting beyond the cannons. She'd sketched here once, years ago with Megan, before everything unraveled. Now her pencil sat untouched in a drawer, her art a casualty of survival. A text buzzed. Her principal, asking her to cover an extra class Monday. She sighed, typing sure. Stability mattered more than passion these days. Liam leaned against her, sipping his juice, and she kissed his forehead. This was her life, messy, hard-won, hers. She'd burned bridges to get here, and the ashes still stung. But Liam was the light in it. Maybe that was enough. This story is a poignant portrait of betrayal, loss, and rebirth after a broken marriage. It is not only about infidelity, but also explores the dark side of love, trust, and the consequences of personal decisions. The main moral of the story: freedom versus consequences. Lydia thought she needed to discover herself and find a new life outside of marriage. But in the end, she realizes that the freedom she craved was an illusion, and the price she paid was too high: a lonely life, a child with no father, and late regret. Loyalty and vulnerability. Jim is a devoted husband who believes in marriage and loves Lydia with all his heart. When Lydia wants an open marriage, he feels deeply betrayed, but instead of clinging or wallowing in grief, he chooses to leave, set his boundaries, and start a new life. The journey of healing and growth. Jim is not just a victim. He finds a way to overcome his pain. He chooses to explore nature, find new connections, and eventually build a happy life with Claire. Meanwhile, Lydia continues to struggle with wrong decisions, ultimately leaving her with a feeling of emptiness. The difference between right and wrong choices. The story shows how one wrong choice can change a life forever. Lydia had a stable family but traded it for a fleeting love. Jim, despite his pain, chooses to move forward, searching for a more meaningful life. What is family really? In the end, Jim rebuilds a new family with Claire and their daughter Ella, a stable home based on trust and respect. Meanwhile, Lydia is stuck in the life she created, raising her child alone with a feeling of regret. Overall message. This story emphasizes that betrayal can destroy a relationship, but it can also become an opportunity for rebirth. The choices we make in life not only affect the present, but also shape the future. If we do not appreciate what we have, one day we may lose it all.